someone figured out how to make a biological weapon with things in the kitchen and it would kill everybody on Earth, I would not let them publish that formula.
Professor James Allan is from the University of Queensland in Australia, where he is the Garrick Professor of Law, the oldest chair at the university. He began his career by practicing law in Toronto and at the bar in London, and he is a passionate advocate for the principles of free speech. He's the author of Democracy in Decline, Steps in the Wrong Direction, and he writes regularly for the Australian newspaper, Quadrant magazine, and the Spectator. So, Professor James Allan, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Anyway, let me ask you my first question, really, which is, why are you passionate about free speech? What's so important about it?
Well, there's three main arguments for free speech. If you have a religious gene, then you'll be someone who thinks that human beings have these natural rights, Jefferson, these self-evident truths. I lack that gene. So, I mean, I understand the whole natural law worldview. I just don't find it very convincing. The other two are the John Stuart Mill idea that society does best when we have a crucible of competing ideas. And if you just let orthodoxy proceed, society does much worse than if you have the dissidents, the apostates, the nonconformists, because sometimes they're going to be right, says Mill. And worse than that, said Mill, even when they're wrong, they put the establishment class on notice that they have to fine-tune their ideas. So that's the sort of Millian idea, very powerful. Mill, of course, his dad was an acolyte of Bentham, and a lot of people don't realize that John Stuart Mill is through and through a utilitarian. He doesn't talk about it the way Bentham does. And the other main argument for free speech, and I think I'm a combination of Mill, but I think this one's even stronger, is in any straight-up cost-benefit analysis, the harms of speech will almost always massively be outweighed by the harms involved in allowing an establishment class, the administrative state, and those with power to be policing speech. So, of course, there's harms when people say nasty things, but setting up a bureaucracy that ends up sort of dragging Mark Steyn through the ringer, the costs of that outweigh the costs of the harms of speech. So anyone who says there's no harms in speech, well, that's just wrong. The problem is that policing speech almost always has way more harms. And so that's just a straight sort of distrust of government argument, which I think is powerfully right.
I know you've got one more argument, wasn't it? But you said you had three. But can I just go back to because you've put together John Stuart Mill,
Yep.
famous for his harm principle, that the state should shrink back, give all the autonomy to the individual as much as it possibly can, up to the point which prevents harm to other people. Okay. But if I'm right, I remember Mill saying that speech should not be classed as harm at all, and that you just weather whatever people say. Acts of violence are harm, but acts of speech were not.
Yeah, Mill comes along and makes a utilitarian argument, a portion of which relies on the harm principle, and you're right. He sees harm solely in terms of physical harm, not psychological harms.
Yeah.
There's a famous debate, the Hart-Devlin debate, and he's one of my favorite legal philosophers, Hart, but I think Devlin takes him to the cleaners in that argument, and Devlin points out the problems with the harm principle, and it is so. Although I like Mill, I think trying to rest everything on the harm principle is pretty tough because you're drawing a lot of arbitrary lines between what sort of harms you're going to allow and what you aren't. Whereas if you just say,
what are the arguments against the harm principle? I mean, I'm a paid up subscriber to the harm principle.
I mean, again, if you're going to, why should you just count? I mean, I'll play devil's advocate. Why should you just count physical harms and not mental harms? And then once you get into mental harms, how do you weigh them? It's subjective. Why don't we just say, let's weigh up the costs of giving any sort of group or government or administrative state the power to police speech and weigh those against any kind of harm you want to talk about. If you want to talk about, the harms involved in feeling offended, they're pretty small, but, they're a harm. And we'll just do our cost benefit analysis. And in almost every case, I think we're better off to allow the speech. I mean, I am not an absolutist if you mean I would never limit any speech. There are some examples where I would say, yes, we have to limit speech. So I think we're always all in the game of placing ourselves on a spectrum. I'm way, way, way at the end of the let's have lots of speech spectrum. But as I said to you before the show started, if someone could come up with a recipe to create a biological weapon that would kill everyone on Earth with just the things in his kitchen, I certainly would not let him publish that recipe. I would stop that speech because I think the obvious harms of allowing the speech are so massive. But again, for me, you're going to have to make a massively big case to limit speech. And the thing is, governments, Starmer, Trudeau, Ardern, they never are in those sort of games. But they're trying to stop people from saying that the COVID came out of a lab, which it did. Or they're trying to say that lockdowns don't have ancillary costs, which were massively more than, I was a big lockdown skeptic because the evidence was clear early on that this is crazy what we're doing.
I'm going to ask you about lockdown a little later on in the talk, but
Yeah.
but can I tie you down a little bit more tightly on this idea that harms can be mental or they can be due to offence? I mean, we live in a society now where a huge number of young people, the Gen Z generation, don't have any support for, or very, very little support for free speech. I think something like there was a survey which said something like 60 or 70% of Gen Z people would put free speech lower than giving offence. That offence shouldn't happen, and therefore free speech needs to be curtailed in order to avoid offence. And they're taking this same argument, surely, that it will cause harm. Free speech causes harm because it causes offence, and therefore we shouldn't have or have a society which prizes free speech. What's your comment on that?
Well, two things. Firstly, Philip, have you seen our education system? It's not surprising young people don't value free speech.
I've been working in it for
Yeah,
30 or
I
30
know.
years.
They are taught not to like free speech. It's shoved down their throats in a sort of propaganda style way. And it's surprising that so many dissident students exist. So I'm not surprised that students say that because you have safe zones, you have all these idiocies. The way I would say it is, I grew up in the 60s. I came from a very vigorous house. I come from a long line of Scots Canadian Presbyterians. We argued over dinner about everything, and then everyone forgot about it, and no one held hard feelings. And my dad sort of expected everyone to have an argument, and if it wasn't any good, everyone told you. And no one, I never understood anyone taking offense at people disagreeing with you. So the problem, I think, is our education system has started treating young kids, starting in primary school, with kid gloves. And they need to learn that there's a lot of people out there in the world who don't agree with them. And the fact you say something that makes them feel bad about themselves is not a reason that you have to be quiet. Now, of course, we're talking legally and educationally. There is another set of constraints on people, which is good manners. And so if you go out, you might want to say, out of etiquette, I'm not going to insult the hostess, even though she's a moron. And that's fine, because otherwise you won't have any friends. But in terms of legal constraints on people, feeling bad about yourself is nothing that the state should ever get itself involved in, because the long-term costs are huge. And one of the long-term costs is we have created a couple of generations of kids who aren't robust.
Yes,
And
I agree with you. I mean, I take that view, but let me try to pin down the actual principle here. I agree that they've been taught to not value free speech, but take you back to Mill. Take you back to the idea that Mill says harm is only to do with physical violence. But if you open the door and say harm can also include mental harm, you open the door to offence being something which may harm somebody. You may hurt someone's, not just their feelings, but you may cause depression. You may cause all kinds of anxiety in them. They may feel, quote, unsafe. Isn't that the principle whereby Mill wanted to shut down that kind of avenue? But if you open it up, then the logical extension of that is the snowflake student, is it not?
well, only if you rest your defense of free speech on the Millian
Oh,
sort of harm principle. If you rested on a sort of crucible of competing ideas to, move society forward, or you make what I think is the stronger consequentialist argument where we're just weighing up the harms, any kind of harm you want to talk about, of giving power to the administrative state or anyone with power versus the harms involved in what speech does. I think that that's a knockout argument.
so that's a
Now, if
utilitarian principle
if
again.
I were Mill, I would try to draw this distinction between physical harm and mental harm. The problem, in my view, is that's a very hard line to police, because sometimes mental harms are palpably worse for some people than physical harms. As you said, they get depression, their lives are ruined. And on the harm principle, you are forced to come in and say, I'm not going to count that. Now, I think you can defend the whole argument much better by saying Mill got a lot right. But the harm principle is a very hard place to rest your entire argument, because you're ending up just arbitrarily saying, I'm not going to count mental harms. Now, I don't want to count them because we're going to have a snowflake generation. Why don't we just say Mill got a lot right, but we don't need the harm principle? This is sort of Devlin's argument in the Hart-Devlin debate. Why don't we just go straight to a consequentialist cost-benefit analysis? So, okay, you can have your mental harms, but look what that creates. It creates a snowflake generation. It creates a society of people who aren't vigorous. They can't stand up for themselves. So this is way worse in the long term.
So really, it's kind of sitting next to Mill. It's really Bentham's principle you're applying here. The cost-benefit analysis is the greatest happiness for society, I suppose. That's another way of looking at it, is it?
Yes, well, in Liberty, there, which is a great book, but at
Mm.
one point in Liberty, Mill says, my entire argument rests on effectively Bentham's utilitarianism argument. That's hardly ever quoted, because everything for Mill ultimately came back to you weigh up, you're weighing up the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And he finesses it a bit better than Bentham. Bentham was a terrible writer, except when he's talking about bills of rights. He's pretty good there, and he's pretty good on excluding evidence, but he's like a computer programmer. His prose is awful. But he never shunned or ran away from tough arguments. And once you get the outlook of Bentham, he basically overturned in the early 1800s the entire sort of intellectual canon in the West, which relied on the sort of great Catholic natural law thinkers. Bentham just said there's nothing to natural law thinking, and he created this sort of utilitarian world, which in Australia still sort of exists. And it exists throughout the West, even in the US. Oliver Wendell Holmes, he was a utilitarian. They had more of the Jeffersonian tradition
And
until
he
about the
started up
70s.
my old college, University College London, on that same principle that you didn't have to be a Catholic in order to be educated.
That's right. And in fact, whoever founded, I think it was the Duke of Marlborough's son who founded University College, right? And then the Duke was so mad, he then gave a huge amount of money to found King's College.
Oh, right.
So yes,
I didn't
because
know
he was infuriated that his son would give money to Bentham. So
that. All right. So your point then is that offense is on one side. Maybe you can be what you say might be offensive, but free speech on the other side overbalances. So on a matter of consequentialism, the dangers of putting offense higher than free speech are much greater. So that's the central argument.
sure, and everyone's going to draw their own sort of ledger differently. For me, I mean, we can play around with scenarios where you'd say, look, long term, I think I'd limit this speech. Maybe if someone came across a list of CIA agents in Soviet Union, you'd say, okay, I don't really think we should be publishing this because the cost. But on everything related to lockdowns, or everything related to the way the press has behaved, the idea that you want to suppress, censor, the cost benefit analysis just isn't working out. And we knew early on with the lockdowns that young people didn't die from COVID, and that was censored. It was like a 10,000 times higher chance of dying if you're over 70 than it was if you were under 30. No one talked about it. They had these trite slogans about we're all in this together. We were in London both COVID Christmases, and the level of propaganda that was being pumped out about the NHS, it was, I mean, any thinking person knew it wasn't true. And and they were suppressing where the leak came from. I mean, seriously, if you said to someone, there is this virus that appeared 20 yards outside the only lab that's dealing with it in all of China, but it had nothing to do with that lab, Philip. It was the bird, the place where you buy birds for dinner about
That's right, the
400
wet
meters
market.
away. That's what caused it. Well, it's possible, but it's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, yeah. So you've mentioned the way in which the narrative or the views of people in society then are controlled. So, and to the detriment of free speech, because some people lose their jobs by questioning these kind of narratives. Where does the biggest threat for free speech today come from?
Well, I think in the last 30 years, it's pretty obvious it comes from the political left. So when I was starting university in the late 70s, the American Civil Liberties Union was funding cases so that neo-Nazis could walk through parts of Skokie, Illinois, that had Holocaust survivors. This was a left-wing organization that valued free speech above everything. And now today, the ACLU is basically a left-wing woke organization that doesn't care about free speech at all. And how did that happen? I mean, when I went through, all of the rebels were on the left side of politics. They were the ones who wanted to have as much free speech. There were some conservative people in favor of free speech, and I'm a lifelong conservative who spent most of his working life in orthodox left institutions. And one of the great things about free speech is it helps the outsiders, the dissidents. The people with power don't need free speech. No one ever wants to suppress speech. If you wanted to say, Philip, about me, Jim, you're just the most witty, charming, George Clooney looking like guy I've ever met, I'm not going to suppress that. So free speech is a tool for the outsiders, because sometimes the outsiders get it right. And governments don't like that. They don't, the thugs in the Boris government, Johnson, who imposed lock, they don't want to be told they got everything wrong, probably ruined the Conservative Party, and that they had no guts at all. They should have been like Ron DeSantis and looked at the data and stood up to the public health cast. They don't want to hear that. And so speech is a tool for the outsiders. And if you're really brave, you realize that even if you happen at the moment to be in a position of power, you ought to allow people to challenge your views. I think it was Churchill who always made sure before he made a decision that someone came in and told him the other side of the argument. You don't really make the best decisions if you're surrounded by yes men. You want someone in the room, more than one maybe, telling you, here's the best arguments we can come up with for the view you don't agree with. Because sometimes you're going to say, wow, maybe I'm making a mistake here. And the problem with our political caste is they have not experienced what it's like to be almost crushed and not allowed to speak. Donald Trump has, and I think that's why we're seeing in his second term so far a very different approach than the first term. His entire cabinet is being staffed with people who were outsiders that the mainstream media tried to crush. And they know what it's like. And so they have a fondness that you don't normally see for allowing speech. It's quite unusual. So I'm sort of delighted about that. I'm marveling at it.
It'll be very interesting to see if RFK Jr. Have I got it right? Robert Kennedy Jr. will actually be agreed and for his nomination. I think that's the most difficult one. He was quite outspoken against vaccines and COVID and those kind of things, and made a lot of.
Now that Hegseth got up on the 50-50 vote, I think he will get up, but it'll be a very close vote. But isn't it remarkable that Democrats vote for all of their nominees? There's no dissenters at all. And then when you have Republican nominees, a lot of Republicans don't vote for their own side. Now, in some ways, that's refreshing. But in other ways, you think in the long term, if you have one team that is ruthlessly on board and another team that isn't, in evolutionary terms, not sure how that works out for the team that sort of caves in all the time. I think they'll get through. I mean, RFK has some crazy ideas, but he has some good ideas too. And I think he was right about the mRNA vaccine. He's wrong about regular vaccines. Regular vaccines are, the evidence for them is overwhelming. The problem is when you lie about the mRNA vaccine, you'll see that, and everyone predicted this, people I was dealing with during lockdown, they said, if we go down this road, then the uptake on the regular vaccines is going to go way down. And that's happening. People who don't trust government over the mRNA vaccines are now not taking mumps, rubella, all the main standard chickenpox vaccines. Well, it's not surprising because they know they were lied to. And then that just transfers over to everything. It's like if you lie to someone 8 times, you can't then say, but I'm telling you the truth this time, Phil. All those forget those other 8 lies. This 9th one, and that was clearly on the cards.
Yes, there was, but the difficulty was at that time that anybody who stood up and put their head above the parapet and said, "I disagree with the government line," they were labeled as producing misinformation. Fact checkers were proliferating at a rate of knots, and anyone who disagreed with the official point of view was someone who was closed down. Did it surprise you that that happened so readily and so quickly, that misinformation became a thing and that people got closed down so quickly?
Well, Philip, you and I weren't surprised because we work in institutions called universities, and this is the standard way of operating there.
Places of free speech, aren't they?
Yeah, I used to think the doctorly caste was probably the best part of the university because they were they were wedded to empirical evidence, but they became politicized faster than just about anything I've ever seen during COVID. And I was on a panel in Melbourne with Jay Bhattacharya, who Trump has named to be in charge of the FTC. I can't remember. He's a cabinet nominee, and he was one of the top 5, well, I'd say top 10 epidemiologists in the world, along with a guy named Kulldorff, who's Swedish, who was at Harvard. Harvard has since gotten rid of him. And Sunetra Gupta, she's at Oxford. She's probably, at the time of COVID, she was recognized as the best epidemiologist in the world. So you got 3 of the best 10. These are not fringe figures. They write the Great Barrington Declaration, which says, let's follow the Swedish model, the Florida model, treat people who are vulnerable, leave everyone else to get along with it. We got 100 years of WHO data. It was the British plan before 2019.
Yep.
And all 3 of those people were savagely attacked. Gupta, they were censoring her. The medical journals like Lancet were a disgrace. How does this happen? It's one thing to try to censor a guy walking down the street who's homeless, but they're trying to censor 3 of the top epidemiologists in the world.
I have direct evidence of that. I did manage to speak to Sunetra Gupta and did a YouTube video with her, and it was taken down within a matter of a short time. Another guy, Peter McCullough. I don't know if you know about Peter McCullough. He's a brilliant guy, and spoke strongly against the COVID vaccination program. He's the most highly published doctor in the world in his field. We're not talking about people who are new or untutored in some way, and yet taken down by a fact checker. And again, that video was dismissed and taken off YouTube as well.
Well, I know something about, my daytime job is a comparative constitutional law, and we had this constitutional referendum in Australia, which effectively wanted to inject race into the Australian Constitution. In Australia, you have to have a vote of all the people. So we have one of the best sort of amendment processes in the world. And it was a very left-wing progressive policy that was brought in, and half of the Conservative Party, of course, supported it. It ended up getting slaughtered. It lost 61-39. But there were only 3 law professors in the entire country who spoke against it. I was one of them. And there were teams of fact checkers who'd come in and say, try to silence us. And here's what fact checking does. Firstly, it doesn't distinguish between claims about facts and opinions. So when you make a claim about facts, there's a tiny little bit of scope where people can say, well, look, here's the overwhelming evidence on one side or the other. They almost never dealt in facts. Even facts are contestable. If someone said, I don't think the sun's going to come up tomorrow, it's a pretty implausible argument. But, you could contest it. Overwhelmingly, when it came to this constitutional referendum, the fact checkers were dealing with opinion. So I said, look, this proposal is awful, and I gave out 5 reasons, one of which was it's going to lead to judicial activism in 10 years. Now, that's an opinion. You might not agree with my opinion, But you can't say it's misinformation. Someone else can say, no, I don't think the judges, and by the way, Anglosphere judges have become incredibly activist. Your British ones are crazy. They're now trying to impose limits on any kind of development based on climate change. So they're bonkers in my view. But fact checking elides that difference between facts and opinion. And almost always we're in the game of offering opinion, sometimes about facts. So the whole fact checking industry or behemoth, to my mind, is overwhelmingly just a hidden form of censorship. I don't have a problem if you want to come out and say, I don't agree with your facts, Philip, and here's why. The best remedy to that is to say more speech. Well, here's why you're wrong. You can't fact check opinions. Opinions about the future are claims that you can't know for certain until the future. Now, some opinions are more plausible than others. Usually the government just doesn't want opinions it doesn't like out there in the public realm. So I thought the entire fact-checking misinformation industry was a disgrace. Boris Johnson should hang his head in shame forever. It was bad during lockdowns. It was bad during the referendum in Australia, and it was bad in the US election about Trump. I mean, some of the claims that they made were just wrong, and others were just opinions, which have proven to be correct.
What do you say to those people who say, look, the internet is full of information. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, and something, as you say, is bonkers. And some of it is actually dangerous. You can go on a website and you find you've got cancer, and someone will give you advice on how to do that. And you just say, eat more Weetabix or take these oils. And people do that instead. And there's some come to the misinformation, which stops them from going and getting proper remedies, maybe. That's just one example of many kinds of misinformation, which can be dangerous. How do you deal with that then?
So I'll give you a long-winded answer. Isn't it remarkable, Philip, that we live at a time when the single greatest defender of free speech is this billionaire rogue guy named Elon Musk, who decided to spend $44 billion to buy Twitter when it was probably worth maybe 22 billion. So he overpaid by double. And he has single-handedly done more for free speech than just about anybody ever. And one of the great things he has done is he's gotten rid of the whole entire industry of fact checkers, who, by the way, have incredible political bias towards progressive left, you name the woke orthodoxy. And instead, he's got community notes. So if you want to say, you can cure cancer by holding your nose and drinking this milkshake upside down while you're standing on your head, the community notes will come in, and that's just you, me, or anyone else, and say, this is ridiculous. Here's the evidence. Community notes deals with speech, with more speech, and it opens it up to anybody to make the claim. And I think probably, we're all imperfect biological creatures. People seem to want to be in search of a perfect remedy. There's no perfect remedies. There's always going to be downs and ups. And I'm a big Democrat in the sense of I support democracy, but there's lots of flaws with democracy. It's just the least bad system going, as Churchill said.
Churchill, yeah.
I think Musk's remedy of having these community notes, which I note that Zuckerberg said he's going to move to with Facebook, where we're not going to have fact checkers, but anybody out there in the entire social media world who wants to point out where this is off can do that. And I think that's probably the best we're likely to get.
So you deal with misinformation by self-regulation, or rather by trusting the people to make more speech which will counteract the bad speech.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even like the terminology of mis and disinformation. I mean, basically, misinformation is the idea that someone has said something wrong unwittingly. And disinformation is where you're sort of like a CIA operative who is deliberately saying things to be false. It used to be you would just say, Philip, you got that wrong. You might not know you got that wrong, but now it sounds better. It's got, a sort of Latinate sound to it, and it's got 4 syllables, 5 syllables. Misinformation, whoa. But all you're really saying is, I think you got that wrong.
But this is the important point. I think what misinformation, the term misinformation, has done, and why it's been introduced into society, is it gives people a handle and a lever by which they can close down speech. Misinformation is by common consent, something we shouldn't have. And therefore, we now have a right to stop misinformation. And we have in our society, I mean, in this country, we've got a new law coming out to do with the internet. I think it's been passed and it's to be enacted soon, preventing people from saying the wrong things on the internet. I think Australia has had similar laws, and certainly Ireland has got laws like that, and the EU has got laws too, of which they're threatening Elon Musk with them as well. As a lawyer, what do you make of those kind of laws?
Well, I agree fully with the preamble that you just stated there. You're completely right. In terms of the kind of laws we're seeing, it is a major problem in the UK. I mean, it's a bit embarrassing that the home of democracy and parliamentary sovereignty has. I think you actually do have a two-tier justice system right now, in the sense that you get different punishments whether you're on the sort of acceptable side of the political spectrum or not. Your Public Order Act bad. I don't know that the EU or Britain will have any luck trying to rein in Musk, because he has the full backing right now of Donald Trump. And go ahead and try to shut down Twitter. I don't see they'll be able to do that, but I could be wrong about that. That's just a prediction. I don't like those laws, and I think we should be fighting back against I mean, the terminology misinformation helps the censors right off the bat,
Yeah,
because it conveys the idea that they are right. And often when you say something's misinformed, all you're saying is, I disagree with you. I don't think you're correct on that. And that doesn't really, I mean, if I say that, people will go, well, I don't care what you think, Jim. But if you go, that's misinformation. It has this aura of, well, we've already decided on this. And
that's the
again,
point. It's already been decided.
it's
If
already
you
been
call something
decided.
misinformation,
Correct.
there's some authority which has said that this is true and this is false. And usually the authority is the government or some
Correct.
agency of the
Yeah.
government.
And again, I'll go back to my earlier point. We need to be ruthless in saying, are we talking about claims about facts? Because in the external causal world, Hume was very good about this, my favorite philosopher. In the world of facts, there are answers imposed on us. That's why double-blind drug trials tell us whether something works or not. In the world of opinion, you're in the world of opinion, and you can't fact check opinions. You can say, I think that's not a very persuasive opinion, or I think that's a pretty unpalatable opinion. And most of the time when you make a claim, there's elements of fact combined with elements of opinion. And the whole fact-checking industry, just if it can find one little opinion it doesn't like, it labels the entire thing misinformation. And we need to, so I would take out all fact checkers. Here's my test for censors. You set up the law, you make me the fact checker. We'll see how long they have that law in place. So take your worst political opponent. Are you prepared to make your worst political opponent the person who gets to operate these laws? I'll have some respect for you if the answer is yes, but we know the answer is not going to be yes. It's a tool to silence views you don't like. And we'd be much better off changing the labeling too, to just going back to the old fashioned, you're a liar, you're wrong-headed.
Right. So we have in this country something which I'm not sure that maybe you do have them in Australia, I'm not sure, but we have something which runs parallel to harmful speech or hate speech, as it's called here. We also have hate crimes. Do you have something similar to that in Australia?
No, you guys are insane. You're going around, your police who can't solve a burglary for, there's no burglaries solved ever, and they're going around handing out these non-criminal hate notices. No one else has that, and they're a disgrace to your country, to be totally, and I love Britain. I'm an Anglophile, but what a disgrace to the country. And let's be honest, 13, 14 years of conservative government. Again, I'm a right of center guy. Many of the bad laws were brought in by conservatives, and none of the bad laws were removed by conservatives. I mean, people ask me, why is reform doing so well? They're doing so well because most of the problems in the UK today, I mean, Starmer's only been in office for what, a year, half a year? Most of the problems are Conservative Party problems. They're the ones who did this to us.
Yeah.
Why would you trust them ever again?
Yes, I'm particularly concerned about non-crime hate incidents, as they're called.
Yeah,
non-crime hate incidents, which I say you don't have, but
yeah.
apparently if you don't commit a crime, but the police don't like something that you've said or done, particularly on the internet, then they can record it on your file. And whenever people are doing a check on whether you're a suitable person for a job, they check out whether you've been recorded with a non-crime hate incident, and that can stop you from getting that job because someone complained about you.
Yeah,
Um,
I had a big life movement when it came to the police. So I grew up in a middle class home. You know, instinctively, I was always very much pro police. When I went to law school, I would be the only one sort of defending the police on these sort of exclusion of evidence cases where they're catching a murderer or a rapist and they sort of cheat a bit to get this guy off the street. I always was instinctively pro the police, but boy, did COVID and lockdowns ever change my mind. I never thought I'd see the day in Australia. The police in Victoria were basically handcuffing pregnant women. They were kicking people they became thugs. And some of the videos, if your viewers go out and watch the videos of how the police behaved in the state of Victoria in Australia, it was unbelievable. And they became agents for the government without any sort of constraints. And so I just really don't trust the police now. And then in the UK, you see the police going around enforcing these non-criminal hate speech. When did they become agents of you know, the LGBT movement? Or when did they become agents for a particular view of how you're allowed to criticize religions? I didn't make the police off. In the old days when they're out solving crimes, and you know, the odd person didn't go through the formalities in getting a search warrant and caught a murderer, and we know this. I had a little bit more sympathy for the police. I used to defend them. I was a big defender of the police, but the last 3 or 4 years, and I don't really blame the person on the street. I think what has happened in Australia, in Britain, in Canada, not so much the US, for various reasons. But the upper echelons of the police have become incredibly politicized. They are agents of a very progressive, if you want to use the word woke orthodoxy, and they all need to be removed. One of the good things Trump is doing is he's moving and he's taking out the upper echelons of the bureaucracy in DC, and I think that needs to be done. I mean, these are the people who are allocating resources, and they're allocating police resources in a way that I don't think the average police officer on the street wants to be doing this. I could be wrong, but I don't think they do. And so
well,
they are the
I
problem.
think they often do what they're told to do, and we have
Yeah,
the
they do.
cost
They
of
want to keep their
policing
jobs. Yeah,
that sets the guidelines.
yeah.
You had someone in Australia who became even well known over here. I'd never heard of him before lockdown, but a guy called Dan Andrews, who seemed to be one of the most authoritarian leaders in the Western world since that I've ever
Yeah.
come across.
It was like a mud wrestling fight to the death between him and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand.
As to who's the worst.
Who was the worst? Justin Trudeau longingly looked at the two of them because he wanted to get in the ring, but I think he was only number three. So the thing was that Andrews ran the state of Victoria. I lived in Queensland, and by world standards, the lockdowns were mild in Queensland. We could still go out, we could play golf, restaurants served on the street. You know, it was pretty hard to get yourself worked up. If I lived in Victoria, I would have been out protesting and probably gone to jail. No, he was a thug. You couldn't go, really strict limits about how far you could go. You couldn't play golf. And they got all the science wrong, by the way.
Yeah,
They
yeah. I
wanted you to
mean,
stay inside and not go outside. They got nothing right. And the
but
problem was that
here's
the opposition party supported him down the line. So people
yeah.
have no one to vote for.
Here's the difficulty here. Am I not right in thinking that he got voted in again?
He did, because the Liberal Party, the Liberals in Australia are the equivalent of the Tories. They they got caught up in this mainstream media propaganda, and they thought this was all very popular. So they supported everything he did. In some instances, they would have gone further. So
Why
if
was it
you
so
are like
popular?
me, who do you vote for?
Why was it so popular among so many people?
Because the worst actors throughout all of COVID, and I've written about this. I mean, I blame the doctorly cast and the pusillanimous politicians, but probably the worst actors were the press. You know, I've had a bit to do with journalism departments in universities, and they get some of the dumbest students in the entire university. And I mean that in terms of the factual high school credentials they bring to university. And they are some of the most politicized parts of the university. There's worse parts. But if you go back 40 years ago, journalists were not university credentialed. They went to they went to a paper, they were apprenticed, they got some curmudgeonly old editor who taught them the importance of getting the facts right. And by and large, the press was okay. Now they go through a university degree where it is incredibly politically one-sided, and they come out thinking that their job is to, make the world better, not to be skeptical and advance sort of the truth. And the press during COVID around the world, I mean, the BBC was awful. We can just go through what they got wrong. They haven't apologized. They pilloried people who said it came out of the lab. They pilloried people who said we're not all in this together. People who pointed out, like me, that we have 100 years of data that show that the WHO relied on as late 2019, and so did the British government, that showed that in these sort of situations, you don't lock down society. You deal with the vulnerable and you leave everyone else. There's loads of data that masks don't work. I still see people walking around, I'm here in England, with masks. During the height of COVID, you'd see them in a car by themselves with a mask. I do not know what theory of viruses leads you to wear a mask in the car by yourself, but basically you're a moron.
Okay,
And this is the problem. The press was not skeptical about anything. They bought the government line. They didn't hold any of the politicians to account. The only politicians, I mean, I think Anders Tegnell, the epidemiologist for Sweden, should get a Nobel Prize in medicine. He was right about just about everything.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that the Swedes didn't cave into the worldwide mania, but it was largely driven by a pusillanimous press whose job is supposed to be skeptical, and they weren't at all. And
yes, this is the root of the problem, it seems to me, that there is a very rare person who has an independent mind, and that the vast majority of people are happy to go along with what the government, what the press says. Why is it that independent thinking is something which human beings don't seem to naturally do, and how do we encourage that better?
Yeah, I think part of it is just the makeup you're born with. Part of it is incentives, of course. If you're going to lose, I mean, I've always been outspoken. That's just the way I am, and I like to fight people. I mean, I don't fight physically, but I like to get into a good argument. But I have sympathy for people who are skeptical, but they think if I say anything, I've got 3 kids, I got a mortgage, my kids are in school, and I'll lose my job. And the problem was you would lose your job. So I have, it's hard. You can't be too critical of people who are trying to help their family and they're afraid to speak. The problem there is the incentives. Now, I do have criticism for people who get to the point where they are well off enough that they have what the Americans would call fuck you money. And they have enough money that you can't really do anything to them. Why are they cowards? Why are they pusillanimous? I don't really understand that.
Or are they simply just unquestioning and uncritical and not independent in their ability to think?
I think that's partly it. And I think at the beginning of COVID, when the press came out and said, we're all going to die, this is the Black Death. Yeah. Fear is a big motivator. Now, as early as March 2020, we had the Diamond Princess cruise liner data in which nobody young died. It was all really old. No one talked about that. The press weren't skeptical. I think to this day, it's still true that the average age of COVID deaths in almost every country on earth is higher than the life expectancy. Just think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
The panic was crazy. My kids went on to the Oxford University website in early 2020, and you could put in all of your details, and it would tell you what your chances of dying from COVID, if you caught it, were. So for my son, I think it was 1 in 250,000, and my daughter's she had even less chance of dying. And we knew early on that young people had almost zero chance. I mean, it was literally true that a person under 30 with any kind of fitness at all had a better chance of dying by being hit by lightning. The press didn't do their jobs. And as soon as you realize that, if you turn to the vaccine, it doesn't matter what you think about this mRNA vaccine, even if you think it works pretty well, which I don't. But even if you think that, the fact is, your chances of dying from the mRNA vaccine, if you're under 30, were higher than your chances of dying for COVID. once you know that, it's immoral to force people to take that vaccine. If
Hmm.
you're under 30, even if it was a remote chance of dying from the vaccine, so we can just put that whole argument to one side, it was still higher than dying from COVID. You should never force people. I used to sit for 8 years on a university ethics committee for this sort of thing, and all anyone ever talked about was autonomy,
Hmm.
and and it just went out the window. I mean, I used to be the most, let's let them do this research. You can't identify the samples. Who cares if they've consented? It just became a glorified informed consent committee. Informed consent went out the window. These people went crazy, and
Does it
they
not
and
frighten you
they.
that it was so easy to do that they could do it again on the turn of a sixpence?
I think it would be harder this time, Philip. I don't. Well, it wouldn't be possible with Trump in office in the U.S. because he
But
has
he'd only be there
appointed.
for 4 years, and then who knows what.
Well, if
And
I were
don't forget,
betting my
Trump,
house right now on the next president after Trump, I'd be putting everything on JD Vance.
he
So I think we're gonna get.
but of course, don't forget, Trump did bring in some of these restrictions. He was the guy who was around during the COVID time, and he, implemented a
Yeah,
lot of
no,
this
and
because
and
he
you
was
know,
advised to do so.
I agree with that. The thing is, he's the kind of guy who'll never apologize. But he has effectively apologized in the sense that everyone he's appointed now were people
Yeah.
he didn't.
Yeah.
And I think the problem for Trump was when he came in the first time, he did not realize that this behemoth of a bureaucracy would try to block him. He's used to being a CEO. If you tell people to go and do X, they try to do X. You come into a federal government, or the Tories come in Britain and they say to the bureaucracy, I want to do X. The bureaucracy doesn't do it. They Trump had people reporting his phone calls to Ukraine, and so that's the first impeachment. I think he's learned, and he realizes that Fauci lied to him, and he realized that the people he was Burks, the people he was relying on, fundamentally were trying to block him behind his back. And having realized that, his appointments now are great. Now, he's not the kind of guy who will ever say, "Look, I got it wrong the first time," but his appointments, I mean, Bhattacharya, what a phenomenal appointment he is to the upper echelons. He's pulled out of the WHO. I think the currently constituted WHO, no country should belong to it. So that's good. And hopefully without any American funding, it's going to be a very different organization.
But the WHO is actually putting into measure health regulations, and also wanted a kind of a protocol or a treaty which would enable it to run the entire world.
I know. And these politicians who had driven us through the worst thuggery. Now, Lord Sumption, I don't agree with him on anything related to Brexit or anything else, and he is part of the sort of establishment progressive class. But he was very brave on COVID, and he came out and said these are the worst infringements on our civil liberties in 300 years. Correct.
Yeah.
And imposed around the world by, in Canada by a sort of left-wing Trudeau, but in Britain by Boris Johnson, who knew better, by the way. Johnson's instincts were right, but he wasn't brave enough to stand up to these
Yeah.
people. To his shame,
Yes, I think that was the problem with Boris. He wasn't brave enough.
wasn't
Tell me,
brave.
you've been very outspoken, though. Have you suffered any problems with your university? Have you had any kickback from that? I mean, have you been tried to be closed down or cancelled in any way?
So if your readers have read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is
Which they probably
which I
have.
which I read 2 years ago, he's a genius. I couldn't believe how great it is. But he continually talks about what he called something, I think I'm paraphrasing, but something like the favorites of fortune. Caesar was a favorite of fortune. I'm a favorite of fortune. I mean, through no skill on my own part, people leave me alone. Now, my university has never directly told me I can't. I once wrote an article saying that vice chancellors were so bad at their job that a moderately numerate year 11 student would do a better job. This was in the national newspaper. Nothing happened. So I think as a conservative, you have two strategies, because basically we don't exist in universities much. I mean, the data in the US is clear. It's something in law schools, it's something like 36-1 Democrat donors to Republicans, because that's public information. That's at US law schools. And I know from The Voice, there's just very few conservative law professors. 2 or 3%, 4 or 5 maybe. Some of them are in the closet. You have two strategies. You can stay in the closet and just get on with tax law or whatever, or you can be unbelievable. I write in all sorts of publications and I'm incredibly open about it. And they just leave me alone because they think that if they did anything, I'm speculating here, I would go ballistic, which I would, and write in the newspaper. And now I'm at a stage in my life where I don't even really care. So I'm a complete loose cannon. So my long-winded answer to you is no, my university has never tried to silence me in any way. I know my deans occasionally come under pressure where they say, because they tell me, can't you do anything to shut Allan up? And they say no, and that's sort of the end of it. But no,
You are therefore very privileged now, because a number of your fellow colleagues, I mean, I've heard of the famous case of Peter Ridd, who questioned the narrative on the Great Barrier Reef and said, well, actually, it's not so bad as everyone thinks. He's had terrible kickback from all of that and been cancelled tremendously, hasn't he?
that story is such a disgrace. I know Peter a little bit. Everything he claimed about the Barrier Reef, by the way, in the subsequent years, the last 5 years, has proven to be correct. So if you just look at the facts and his claims about the next 5 years, he was right. His university fired him based on the code of conduct. So they said, we're not firing you because of your views. We're firing you because when we disciplined you, you told other people about it. And that's a breach. And that's a breach of your code of conduct. Now, how are you supposed to defend yourself? At one point, the university said he couldn't even mention the charges against him to his wife. And then it gets worse. We had a conservative government, the Liberals, and they didn't do anything to protect him. And then it went to our top court, 7 judges. 5 of them had been appointed by the conservative side of government, and they unanimously held against him on the basis that they said, oh, this was the worst part of the judgment. It was basically the first 20 pages were a paean to the importance of academic freedom. It isn't this. And then in the second half of the judgment, they said, but of course, you can't breach confidentiality. And what was the breach of confidentiality? Telling people that I'm being persecuted by so they said the university was wrong in attacking you at the first, but once they did that, you can't go and tell people. So effectively, it was just a hollow claim about academic freedom. There is nothing that Ridd could have done. Once they here's the model they sort of said, you have to sit there and for 5 years be persecuted, bankrupted, and then you can go and hire a top QC, KC, and bring judicial review, and we, the top court, will then support you. And we'll support you when you go for judicial review sometime 5 years down the road. I mean, it was laughable. So the court let him down badly. The Scott Morrison conservative side of government, they didn't lift a finger to help him. They did it to their eternal shame.
What's really shocking, I find, is that this is all taking place in a university setting where ideas need to be contentious, where you need to challenge the expected orthodoxy. You need to be able to voice maverick opinions, and the university should be a kind of a hallowed space whereby anything can be challenged. I mean, that really is, to me, the definition of a university, a place where any ideas can be challenged and can be, new ideas can be put forward. But in this university and in very similar universities around the world now, we're losing that open space.
Well, I mean, as a statement of fact, universities are awful now. And you're right. As an opinion about how you'd like the world to be, I completely agree with you. That is not how universities are. They are orthodox left institutions, radically so. Many of the people who make their way to the top of the bureaucracy are some of the worst academics in the university. They spend most of their working lives just doing what they're told, and then they become vice chancellors. They can't stand up to Palestinian encampments that are shouting the most provocative things. And again, on Palestinian encampments, I don't have a problem with people showing that they're, thugs. What bothered me was that the university authorities allowed these encampments on university grounds. And, you don't have to be a genius. It's basic U.S. First Amendment jurisprudence that free speech does not allow you to go and knock on someone's door with a loudspeaker and yell your view through their door. You have to respect property. Universities could have closed down these encampments in the US. They could do it on day one without breaching any free speech principles. I mean, my university in Australia, of course, we had a Palestinian encampment. Everyone out there supporting the people who murdered little 6-month-olders on October 7th, which was a disgrace. But we were the only university that had a Jewish counter encampment.
Oh.
And I used to go and sit with them every day and for an hour, have a coffee. And the Palestinian encampment people would walk around ours and they'd be taking photos. Now, that's an incitement to violence. It was
Yeah.
pure provocation, and the university did nothing about it. They would come every morning and say, "How are you doing?" But that's a bit late. So the real problem with universities is the sort of people who are making it to the top of the university administration. And combine that with the fact that we now have, and this is Jonathan Haidt, who's a really interesting sort of center-left guy in the US,
Yeah.
who goes through the data, and universities are now, there just are no conservatives on campus. As I said, in the law schools, it
17
might,
to 1, I think, was the
yeah.
ratio.
Think of a women's studies department or a sociology department. I mean, except for Frank Faridy, can we think of a sociologist who's not to the left of Keir Starmer? Because I can't.
No.
And so these universities are they don't see themselves as in the game of furthering an objective truth, because a lot of the left-wing thinking doesn't believe in an objective truth.
Yeah.
Anyone who says my truth, this is my truth, take them to your door and usher them outside and don't let them ever inside your door. There isn't my truth. There is a truth.
Truth. Yeah.
You might be good at discovering, you might not be good. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong.
That,
And then there are opinions.
that's
People's
probably
opinions can differ.
that's probably the fundamental shift in the whole of society, is actually the move from holding on to the truth as an absolute to move to my truth, and then it becomes a power game as to whose truth wins. It's a Foucault kind of setup. So, James, we've come pretty well to the end of our talk, and I thank you for your time. But I've got one last question for you. If you were to look ahead to the future, to the next, let's say, 10 years, maybe even 20 years, from your point of view, are you hopeful or are you pessimistic? Are laws going to enable us to be freer? I know that Trump is someone who you admire in America, but 10 years time, where will we be?
Well, I used to get into arguments with some of my conservative friends who just said, Trump, I can't stand him. I won't vote for him. He's a boor. He's a cross. And my view is, look, the most important attribute you bring to the table today in the political world is bravery. Will you stand up for the kinds of things that we care about? Truth, a little bit of skepticism about the doctorly cast, that sort of thing. And whatever else you say about Trump, he has more bravery than any politician since maybe Churchill. I mean, on different matters. He just is a brave guy. And because he's brave, the normal routes of silencing people and making them cave in, all of which worked with Boris Johnson, all of which worked with Scott Morrison, the prime minister, he doesn't give in. And I was pretty pessimistic. But since this US election, already Trump's done more for free speech than any British prime minister in 14 years. He's cleared out all the DEI. He's removed it from the military. I don't know if you saw the executive order he signed a couple of days ago. Every single member of the US military who was fired for not taking the vaccine will get his job back if he wants it, plus full back pay, plus an apology. Can you imagine a British politician doing that? I can't. And so he seems to believe in a weird kind of way, Trump seems to believe in the sort of ideals that we have. Now, he brings to the table a lot of personal attributes that we don't like, but for me, bravery is the single most important attribute in a politician right now. A willingness to stand up for sort of Western civilization, which is the best.
But
these are the best places to live ever, and truth. And so I'm pretty optimistic. I think Trump is going to make it near on impossible for the EU to function the way it's been functioning, and they're going to make it near on impossible for Starmer and to keep running I mean, just take net zero on a sort of non-political thing. If Trump gets rid of, he's pulled out of Paris and net zero, already energy prices in some US states are a third to a quarter of what they are in the UK. There will be no manufacturing in the UK. There will be no manufacturing in Australia. How do these governments, when the tire hits the road and the real effects of this hit the average, how do they get voted back in? They cannot. And at some point, you're going to get a Farage-like party that says we're getting out of net zero. We're going to get rid of the Equality Act has to go. And I see Reform has said they're going to go get rid of that. You're going to get rid of the public order off, what's it called? The Public Order Act, whatever that, all the hate speech, no, they're all going to go. So it's going to get bad in Australia and Britain. But if you want to see the effect, look at Pierre Poilievre in Canada. I mean, he's sort of a nice version of Trump in the sense that he's not as crass and boorish.
Right.
But he's already challenged, he just doesn't take any guff from the press. And he says, you're just biased. I'm going to cut. He has promised to cut the CBC, which is like your BBC. They're going to cut the budget in half. Well, that just makes me smile. You've got this orthodox, massive national broadcaster.
To the BBC, yes, I know they wanted the licensing fee to disappear.
Just
but yeah, anyway, Professor James Allan, thank you ever so much indeed for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for spending time talking about it.
Well, thank you, Philip. And if you want any advice on, clothes, where I bought my jacket, you just let me know.